The rain poured relentlessly, turning the city streets into rivers of silver and shadow. Ethan leaned against a lamppost outside the cozy bookstore, his breath misting in the chilly air, his heart pounding like a drum. He'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. No, 1,000. Each scenario had played out in his mind, from joyous acceptance to awkward rejection. The weight of his emotions pressed heavily on him, yet he couldn't let this chance slip away. Tonight, he would confess his feelings to his best friend Lucas. Their friendship had been a constant in Ethan's life, a thread woven through the fabric of his years. It was a bond built on countless shared memories, late-night study sessions that devolved into fits of laughter, spontaneous road trips to nowhere, and quiet moments where no words were needed to feel understood. It was a connection that felt as natural as breathing. Yet tonight, Ethan yearned to transform it into something more, something deeper. The distant sound of hurried footsteps broke Ethan's reverie. Lucas appeared, his familiar figure cutting through the haze of rain, his warm smile glowing like a beacon against the dreary backdrop. His dark hair clung to his forehead, droplets tracing paths down his cheeks. Ethan's breath caught at the sight, a rush of affection and nerves tangling in his chest. Even soaked from the rain, Lucas radiated a kind of effortless charm that left Ethan spellbound. "Hey!" Lucas called out, his voice a welcome warmth amidst the cold. "Been waiting long?" Ethan shook his head, forcing a smile. "Not really. You look like you swam here." Lucas laughed, the sound rich and comforting. "Blame the weather," he said, shrugging as he wiped water from his face. "But you're one to talk. You're just as drenched." They ducked into a quiet cafe nearby, the inviting aroma of coffee and baked goods wrapping around them like a blanket. Shaking off the rain, they settled into a corner booth, their laughter mingling with the soft murmur of other patrons. The flickering candlelight on the table cast a warm glow, softening the tension in Ethan's chest. As they sipped their drinks, they fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about old adventures and trading playful jabs. Each memory they unearthed felt like a treasure, moments that once seemed ordinary, now glimmering with a newfound significance. Ethan clung to the sound of Lucas's laughter, the way his eyes crinkled at the edges, the way he leaned forward as if he couldn't bear to miss a single word Ethan said. But as the minutes ticked by, Ethan's resolve wavered. The words he had practiced seemed to evaporate before they could reach his tongue. How could he risk shattering this perfect, unguarded moment? Just as he summoned the courage to speak, Lucas's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the spell. Ethan glanced down, his heart stuttering at the sight of a message lighting up the screen. "Did you tell him yet?" The words hung in the air like an unspoken question. Lucas's smile faltered. His hand darted out, flipping the phone over before Ethan could say anything. "Sorry," Lucas muttered, his voice tight. "Just, work stuff." Ethan studied him, his chest tightening. Lucas was avoiding his gaze, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Suspicion and hope warred within Ethan, his thoughts spiraling. Did you tell him yet? The cryptic message pulsed in his mind, its implications impossible to ignore. Was Lucas hiding something or someone? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Ethan clenched his hands in his lap, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The rain outside battered the windows, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo the storm brewing in his chest. This was it. This was his moment. All he had to do was take the leap. But as Lucas finally lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a vulnerability that mirrored his own, Ethan realized he wasn't the only one holding something back. "Who's that?" Ethan asked, forcing a casual tone as he gestured toward the figure in the distance. Lucas's smile faltered, his eyes flickering with something Ethan couldn't quite place. "No one important," he replied, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He turned away quickly, pretending to busy himself with his drink, but Ethan noticed the way his fingers tightened around the glass. Ethan didn't press further, not yet. He let the conversation drift to safer topics, but the unease settled in the pit of his stomach, refusing to fade. Lucas had always been the steady one, the person Ethan could count on to be unshakable. So why did he seem so rattled now? And who was that person? As the evening wore on, Ethan's curiosity morphed into a gnawing sense of dread. He told himself it was nothing. Lucas deserved his privacy, but the doubts wouldn't leave him alone. By the time the city lights dimmed and silence fell over the streets, Ethan found himself standing outside Lucas's apartment, heart pounding. He stared at the door for a long moment, the spare key Lucas had given him years ago weighing heavily in his hand. They trusted each other. He shouldn't do this. But what if something was wrong? What if Lucas was in trouble? Guilt gnawed at him as he slid the key into the lock and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, quiet save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything was as it always was. Lucas's impeccable organization, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Yet something felt off, an undercurrent of tension Ethan couldn't ignore. His eyes drifted to Lucas's desk, where a folder sat slightly askew. Curiosity got the better of him, and he approached cautiously. The folder was labelled with a single word that sent a chill down his spine. Ethan. Hands trembling, he opened it. Inside were photos, candid shots of him at the park, at work, even at home. There were notes scrawled in Lucas's handwriting, observations about his daily routines, and surveillance records. His breath caught in his throat, dates, times, details about where he'd been and who he'd been with. His world spun. Why would Lucas be gathering information about him? What could this mean? The sound of the door clicking open jolted him out of his thoughts. He whirled around, folder clutched in his hands. Lucas stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale as a ghost. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Lucas's voice was low, a mix of panic and anger, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. Fear.
Ethan stepped back, his grip tightening on the folder. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, his voice trembling. "What is all this, Lucas? What have you been hiding from me?"
Ethan held up the folder, his hand shaking slightly. His voice was tight with emotion as he confronted Lucas. "You tell me, what is this?" Lucas hesitated, his eyes darting from Ethan's face to the folder in his hand. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his damp hair, his expression a mix of guilt and frustration. "You weren't supposed to see that," he finally said, his voice quieter than Ethan had expected. "It's not what you think." Ethan's eyes burned with betrayal as he stepped closer, holding the folder like it was a weapon. "Not what I think," he demanded, his voice rising. "Then explain it to me, Lucas, because right now it looks like you've been lying to me this whole time." Lucas pressed his lips together, as if debating whether to speak. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of whatever secret he was about to reveal. "I work for a private organization," he confessed, his words slow and deliberate. "They hired me to keep tabs on you." Ethan felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. He stumbled back a step, clutching the folder like a lifeline. "You've been spying on me?" His voice cracked, the hurt cutting through every syllable. "At first, yes," Lucas admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But it's not like that anymore. Ethan, please, you have to believe me. I didn't know you then. I didn't know how amazing you were, how much you'd mean to me." He took a step closer, his expression pleading. "I fell for you. That's the truth. I swear it." Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. They all collided, leaving him paralyzed. Was this a genuine confession, a desperate attempt to salvage their relationship? Or was it just another carefully crafted lie? He searched Lucas's face for answers, for something that would make sense of the chaos in his heart. Before he could find the words to respond, a loud crash shattered the tense silence. Glass exploded inward as the room was suddenly filled with the deafening sound of breaking windows. Ethan barely had time to react before a masked figure leapt through the shattered frame, moving with deadly precision. "Lucas, get down!" the intruder barked, his voice cold and commanding. But his focus was clear. Lucas was the target. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat as the scene unfolded in an instant. Lucas pushed Ethan behind him, his body tense and ready for a fight. "Stay back," he warned, his voice sharp and protective. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as questions screamed through his mind. Who was this intruder? And why did it feel like Lucas was no stranger to situations like this? "We warned you," the intruder growled, his voice low and menacing. "You're too close." Before Ethan could react, the man lunged. Lucas shoved Ethan behind him in one fluid motion, positioning himself between Ethan and the threat. His movements were precise and calculated, revealing a skill Ethan had never seen before. The fight erupted with startling ferocity. Fists flew, and the sound of grunts and scuffling filled the narrow alley. Lucas moved like a seasoned fighter, his strikes landing with precision. But the intruder was relentless, fighting with the desperation of someone with everything to lose. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears as he watched Lucas deflect a blade with a well-timed block. Finally, with a brutal uppercut, Lucas sent the intruder stumbling backward. The man groaned, clutching his side before darting into the shadows, his retreat as silent as his arrival. Lucas stood hunched over, catching his breath. The dim light from a street lamp illuminated the gash on his cheek, a crimson trail glistening against his skin. "Lucas!" Ethan exclaimed, stepping closer. "You're hurt." "It's fine," Lucas interrupted, his voice tight. He wiped the blood with the back of his hand, his expression unreadable. Ethan's gaze darted between Lucas and the direction the intruder had fled. "What aren't you telling me?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. Lucas hesitated, his shoulders sagging as the tension drained from his stance. He looked away, his jaw tightening before he finally spoke. "The organization I worked for, they're dangerous, ruthless. They've been watching you for a long time." Ethan blinked, his stomach twisting. "Me? Why? What do they want?" "They want something you have," Lucas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Ethan, guilt etched into his features. "A family heirloom. It's not just sentimental, it's the key to a vault they've been trying to access for years. They sent me to retrieve it." Ethan stared at him, his throat dry. "I agreed to the job before I knew you," Lucas said quickly, stepping closer as if to plead for understanding. "It was supposed to be simple, but then I got to know you, who you are, what you've been through, and I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't betray you." His voice cracked as he added, "So I've been trying to protect you instead." Ethan's world spun as the words sank in. "And now they're coming after both of us," he murmured, his voice trembling. Lucas nodded grimly. "And they won't stop until they get what they want." Ethan stepped back, his chest tightening as the weight of Lucas's words sank in. His voice trembled, tinged with disbelief and hurt. "So everything was a lie? Our friendship, your feelings? Was I just some mission to you?" Lucas's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as he reached out, but Ethan flinched away. "No, I swear my feelings for you are real. Ethan, please listen to me. I've been trying to protect you, not deceive you. That's why I couldn't tell you everything." Ethan's breath hitched. "Protect me from what, Lucas? From the truth? From you?" Before Lucas could answer, his phone buzzed again, cutting through the tension like a knife. The harsh, distorted voice of a message played, "Hand over the key, or you both pay the price." The room fell silent, the ominous words lingering in the air. Ethan's gaze darted to Lucas's phone, then to the man he thought he knew. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories, cryptic comments, and moments that suddenly carried a darker undertone. "What key?" Ethan demanded, his voice firmer now, suspicion laced in every syllable. Lucas hesitated, his jaw tightening before he exhaled deeply. "The pendant, your father's pendant. It's not just a keepsake, Ethan. It's the key they've been searching for. I didn't know at first, but once I realized, I couldn't risk losing you to them." The revelation hit Ethan like a freight train. The heirloom his late father had entrusted to him, a seemingly innocuous pendant he wore out of sentimentality, was far more than it appeared. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of revelations and danger. Lucas's past as a spy unfolded before Ethan in pieces. Whispered confessions, hastily packed bags, and stolen moments of vulnerability. The lines between truth and lies blurred as the gravity of their situation became impossible to ignore. Despite the betrayal Ethan felt, an undeniable pull kept him tethered to Lucas. When the organization's threats escalated, they made a choice. A fragile truce forged in desperation and lingering affection. Together, they vowed to expose the corruption within the shadowy organization and safeguard the pendant. As they prepared for the battle ahead, Ethan couldn't help but steal glances at Lucas. Even with the secrets and chaos that had upended his world, one truth remained unshakable. His heart still ached for the man who had lied to protect him. Their journey was fraught with danger at every turn. Shadowy figures followed them, messages filled with veiled threats arrived at every safe house, and the line between allies and enemies blurred. Each step closer to the truth unraveled deeper layers of the organization's dark secrets, its true motives, its vast reach, and the powerful people it had in its pocket. Despite the danger, Lucas never wavered, his resolve unwavering as he protected Ethan. Their nights were spent in relentless training, Lucas teaching Ethan how to defend himself, their whispered plans punctuated by the quiet hum of determination. In those stolen hours, the walls Ethan had built around himself began to crumble. Lucas's every action, every selfless gesture spoke volumes. He shielded Ethan from harm, shared his limited food rations, and stood guard while Ethan slept. Ethan, who had always doubted the intentions of others, couldn't ignore the sincerity in Lucas's every move. A bond began to grow between them, fragile yet undeniable, as they moved from reluctant partners to something more. The tension between them was electric, a shared understanding growing in the spaces where words were unnecessary. The final showdown unfolded in the dim, foreboding expanse of an abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts. The air was thick with dust and the sharp tang of rusted metal, the eerie silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Celine, the organization's calculating leader, stepped out from the shadows, her presence commanding and chilling. "You should have handed over the key," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Now it's too late." The atmosphere exploded into chaos, bullets ricocheted off steel beams, sparks flying as the firefight erupted. Lucas moved like a force of nature, his instincts sharp, always positioning himself between Ethan and danger. But even he couldn't escape unscathed. A sharp crack echoed through the warehouse, and Lucas staggered, a bullet ripping into his side as he shielded Ethan. "No!" Ethan screamed, catching Lucas before he fell. Blood seeped between Ethan's trembling fingers as he pressed desperately against the wound, his voice breaking. "I'm not losing you. Stay with me, Lucas, please." Despite the pain, Lucas managed a faint smile. "You've got this, Ethan. I believe in you." Fueled by desperation and a surge of determination, Ethan sprang into action. He darted through the chaos, clutching the pendant that the organization had so ruthlessly pursued. His mind raced, piecing together everything he'd learned. At the last moment, he found the control panel buried in the shadows. With a deep breath, he inserted the pendant, its intricate mechanisms aligning perfectly. The warehouse shuddered as the organization's systems powered down, alarms blaring in protest. As Selena lunged toward him, rage contorting her face, the distant sound of sirens grew louder. The authorities, tipped off by an anonymous source, stormed the warehouse just in time. Officers poured in, dismantling the operation piece by piece. Ethan rushed back to Lucas, cradling him as the chaos ebbed around them. Tears streaked Ethan's face as he whispered, "You're going to be okay, I promise." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a flicker of hope ignited in the ruins of their fight. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment, they had won a small yet significant victory. Together. Months later, Lucas was still recovering. His arm rested in a sling, the faint ache a constant reminder of everything that had happened. The cafe where they now sat felt both familiar and strange, like stepping into a memory that had shifted slightly out of focus. The scent of freshly ground coffee beans lingered in the air, mingling with the faint notes of vanilla from a nearby table. Outside, rain drizzled softly against the windows, blurring the bustling city beyond and casting a muted glow over the world. Lucas stared out at the droplets racing down the glass, lost in thought until Ethan's voice gently pulled him back. "Lucas." Ethan's tone was soft, careful. It wasn't like the confident voice Lucas had grown used to. There was a fragility to it now, born from the months they had spent rebuilding what they almost lost. Lucas turned to him, finding Ethan's hand already reaching across the table. The gesture wasn't rushed or hesitant, it was deliberate, as though Ethan wanted Lucas to know that no matter how long it took, he would wait. Their fingers touched, and Lucas felt a warmth that contrasted the chill of the rainy afternoon. Ethan's grip tightened slightly, his thumb brushing over Lucas's knuckles in a silent reassurance. "No more secrets?" he asked, the words carrying a mix of hope and apprehension. His green eyes searched Lucas's face, not demanding an answer but pleading for one. For a moment, Lucas hesitated, his breath catching. The weight of everything, his mistakes, Ethan's sacrifices, the scars they both carried, pressed against his chest. But then he nodded, his lips curling into a small, tired smile. "No more secrets," he said, his voice firm despite the lingering tremor of vulnerability. The tension between them dissolved like mist in the morning sun. As their fingers intertwined fully, Lucas felt the weight on his chest lift ever so slightly. The storm that had raged between them had finally passed, leaving behind not devastation, but a quiet, resolute strength. Their love, tempered by fire, now felt unbreakable, a bond forged in trust, sacrifice, and unyielding devotion. The cafe grew quieter as the rain outside picked up. Lucas leaned back slightly, letting the calm wash over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't looking over his shoulder or bracing for another fight. He was simply here, with Ethan, in a moment that felt as close to peace as he could remember. Ethan's thumb paused its gentle caress on Lucas's hand, and his gaze shifted, suddenly distant. Lucas frowned slightly, tilting his head. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, his lips parting as though he were about to say something, but then thinking better of it. His hand twitched in Lucas's grip, the tension in his body unmistakable. "Ethan?" Lucas pressed, his voice tinged with concern. Ethan finally met his gaze, his expression conflicted. "There's something I need to tell you." The air between them seemed to freeze, the warm comfort of the moment replaced by an icy sense of foreboding. Lucas's pulse quickened as he studied Ethan's face, the subtle shift in his demeanor setting off alarms in his mind. "What do you mean?" Lucas asked, his voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders sagging as though carrying an invisible weight. I thought I could let it go. But after everything we've been through, you deserve to know." Lucas's grip on Ethan's hand tightened instinctively, his mind racing. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, the patter of droplets against the window matching the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat. "What is it, Ethan?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan looked away for a moment, his jaw clenching before he forced himself to meet Lucas's gaze again. "It's about that night, the night everything fell apart. There's someone else involved." Lucas's breath hitched, his heart plummeting as the words hung in the air. "Someone else," he repeated, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. Before Ethan could respond, the door to the cafe swung open, the bell above it jingling sharply. Both of them turned instinctively, their eyes landing on the figure standing in the doorway, a silhouette framed by the rainy afternoon light. The figure stepped inside, shaking off droplets from a dark coat, their gaze locking onto Lucas and Ethan with unnerving precision. Lucas's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. "No," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan's hand slipped from his grasp, his body tensing as he stood. "Lucas, I need you to trust me," he said urgently, his voice low. But Lucas couldn't look away from the figure approaching their table, the storm outside paling in comparison to the tempest brewing within him. And just like that, the fragile peace they had fought so hard to build began to crack.